with understanding the skeleton as like the primary backdrop of our movement potential, skeletons move. They have distinct, joint actions, and that these joint actions, there's one group of joint actions that fall under the topic of compression joint actions and another that fall under expansion joint actions, and they're stereotypical. So, with expansion, you've got flexion, abduction, external rotation, plantar flexion, supination as your big five joint actions. And that gets coupled with respiratory action of inhalation. Okay, so on the other side, you've got the exact mirror opposite joint actions and respiratory actions.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome back to the New Fit Undercurrent podcast. My guest today is Dr. Pat Davidson, who I just got to meet in the last couple of weeks recording this at one of his seminars, and I just loved his approach, loved his content, and I'm really excited to have him on to share his message and his approach with all of you here in New Fit Nation. So one of the things that I like about Dr. Pat is that he's the type of guy who is both a deep intellectual thinker and really, really gets it at that intellectual level, and then also lives it experientially, leads by example, practices what he preaches. And I love that combination. So I've got a lot of respect for you, Dr. Pat, and I'm really, really grateful to have you on.
No, thank you very much. And, I really enjoyed the seminar where you attended recently in LA. I usually get asked to teach the resistance training seminar that I do most frequently. So the seminar that I taught with table testing and being able to change movement possibilities for people is one that I don't get to do as often. And I love that content. So it was really kind of, it was a pleasure for me being able to do that one again. And it was a great audience, and meeting you there was fantastic as well. So yeah, I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to jump on here with you and explore some of those topics in more depth.
Awesome, thank you. And it was, just as an aside, it was fun to get to be a student for part of that time, to be in the audience again, work, get some of my own continuing education there, which I like. We should always be learning, always keep learning. And I think this will be a good opportunity for everyone listening to learn as well. So before we dive into some of those details, I would like to talk to you big picture, exercise science, fitness, performance. You talk about this notion of the fitness industry being fragmented, how there could possibly be a unified theory of exercise science where everything can sort of fit and have its place. And I know you talked about these 7 pillars, and perhaps that's part of the answer. But with these pillars, it seems like you are getting pretty close to a unified theory of exercise science. And from my background as an engineer, I really like how you've organized movements and exercises in these different categories in a way that really makes sense. Can you tell us more about your system for, call it, organizing fitness?
Yeah, and I think that my background, I always find that following someone's Hansel and Gretel breadcrumb trail is a good way to get an idea of like what they think, how they think, and why they think that way. And I'm from Massachusetts originally, and in that sphere, when I was there and as a student in the early 2000s, Mike Boyle and Eric Cressy really dominated that area. And, as well as probably like the thoughts coming from Mark Verstegen as well from Athletes Performance. And like with that Cressy, Boyle, Verstegen, Gray Cook kind of thought process sphere, a lot of, especially Boyle, I always found Boyle to be an incredible categorical thinker. The way that he organized his building and the way that he organized the structure of training sessions for athletes that walk through that door. There was a name for everything that he had them doing. There was tissue quality that you did first. And he approached that with like myofascial release, and you'd follow that with tissue, I believe, extensibility, which was with different stretching protocols. And then you're getting into movement velocity with change of direction work, sprinting, medicine balls, movement power with Olympic lifts, strength following that. There was a category literally for everything. Each day was classified as, hey, this is a linear movement day, or this is a lateral movement day. And on linear movement day, you're training all of the muscles that would be helping you move in a straight line. So if you were in that beginning phase of foam rolling and stretching, you're going to foam roll your quads, your hamstrings. And if you're on the lateral day, you're going to be foam rolling your adductors and abductors. So there was just a very clear thought process that went through the whole day. We're on linear day. Your conditioning at the end would be something along the lines of like the fan bike or maybe tempo runs. And on the lateral day, it would be something along the lines of like the slide board. So there was always a thread that wove its way through each day based on the foundational categories that he worked with. So, I think that's a strong part of my beginnings and set me up to really work from a categorical approach towards training. And I think that from there, the most recent thing for me was the Glazier paper from 2017, which was titled "Moving Towards a Grand Unifying Theory of Exercise Science," and that's kind of more colloquially known as the constraints paper. And so Glazier was saying that the thing that's going to tie all of exercise science together is the utilization of constraints. And constraints are basically like boundaries between things, which to me is just another way of saying categories. Like there's a boundary between that which is a hinge and that which is a squat. There is a boundary between that which would be purely the frontal plane versus the sagittal plane. And what constraints do ultimately, though, is they create definitions, they create directionality. And without those things, nothing takes shape. Everything is like mushed together, and there's no differentiation between topics or ideas or categories or movements. And it's tricky because it seems almost as if these points of differentiation can be arbitrary, when it comes to really evaluating the reality of movement. But it's very helpful to have those points of demarcation, because otherwise it's too blurred and you can't do anything in a realm that's just too blurry ultimately. And so to be able to have anything really emerge and take place, you really need to be able to create like a domain for that thing to live in that's different than another domain. And I think that ultimately, if we're able to do that very accurately, we're able to ultimately create the foundation for, that which becomes like a big, almost backdrop spreadsheet to be able to work from. Pick and choose this tool, not this tool, this movement, not that movement. And what I'm actually really reminded of is, and in the book that I wrote on this, like one of the first things that I talked about was actually Carolus Linnaeus, who is most famous for having written Systema Naturae, which is the taxonomy of life, where we have the kingdoms, the phylums, the orders, the class, the genus, the species, on and on and on, and giving everything that's alive on this planet its own little box that it exists inside of. And it helps to be able to see the tree that emerges from this. And ultimately, I look at what Linnaeus did with the taxonomy, and it's a representation of this idea of constraints. He really built like a tree that created a constraint model to be able to differentiate life forms from one another. And it's been something that has proven to have tremendous utility since he built it, that modern day biologists are still utilizing to help them be able to distinguish life forms from one another.
And then in terms of, biologists using that framework to distinguish life forms from one another, how are you then applying that in program design? How are you
Yeah.
taking these categories and applying them, in daily practice in the gym?
So yeah, in a lot of ways, I was kind of thinking, well, what would be the equivalent for exercise of sort of like kingdom, phylum, order, class, genus, species? Um, and what I did was I did create these 7 pillars, and I think that they ultimately differentiate movement and divvy it up so that we arrive at a place of tremendous specificity identification for movements, that it's this and not that. So with those pillars, it's like pillar 1 is movement quality, and I divide it up inside of that between there's different motor patterns, there's different stances you can do the motor patterns from, and there's different cardinal planes of motion you can move through. And pillar 2 is movement quantity. So there's different loading zones, velocity zones, and duration zones. And from there, pillar 3 is movement standardization. So this one differentiates between the planes and tells you if you're actually uh, performing the movement within the plane in a way that's competent. There's you can look out into the world and see people exercise, and almost immediately see like, oh, that looks good versus that's not a good one right there. But what really is kind of the foundation for what makes movement good versus not good? I tried to really pull that together in pillar 3. Pillar 4 is movement progression. So, this one runs on this big spectrum of the concept of ground, and ground is this external support and neurological feedback. And on one extreme end of the spectrum, there's extremely low ground exercises that are unsupported and have basically no feedback going to the performer. And on the extreme other end, there's like very high levels of support and very low levels of feedback. So if we're using a squat as an example, on the extreme high end of ground would be something along the lines of like a hack squat, where you're in a machine and it's very supported. There's shoulder supports, there's back support, there's handles that you have for support, there's a foot plate. The machine is on tracks. You're actually laying back into it rather than standing fully upright against gravity. Um, you have a ton of sensory information from the standpoint of you're touching a lot of different things with your body and your hands and your feet. So it's loaded with support and feedback. And on the complete other end of the spectrum would be something along the lines of like a rear foot elevated, but your rear foot would be in a TRX strap and your front foot would be standing on a Bosu ball, something like that, where there's very little support. The floor that you're standing on is extremely deformable and therefore less and less supportive. The foot is really just in an incredibly deformable placeholder, and you don't have a lot going on around you. There's nothing to hold on to or touch. Like, you're kind of left to your own devices. So the adaptations that you would get from exercise are different based upon where the exercise lies on this ground spectrum. And for certain athletes, if you're essentially, the more that you're supplying ground into the exercise, the more that exercise would be able to give you an opportunity to easily develop hypertrophy and traditional strength. And on the other end, it's going to be an exercise where you're going to have a lot of neurological uh, you know information being passed back and forth between efferent and afferent, and you're potentially going to develop uh, or at least point out levels of motor control and coordination that the person would have. So From there, we move on to pillar 5, which is movement strategies. And this one is saying that there's really only two fundamental movement strategies that exist. One of them is compression, and the other one is expansion. And this would be true from non biological movement all the way through biological movement and human movement. That, in space, like the universe, is either compressing or expanding at the level of the heart. The heart sometimes is compressing and sometimes expanding, systole and diastole. At the level of joints, we think of these things from the terms that we apply to them, such as supination or extension or abduction. But the reality is that the actual constraints of the bones, the articulations, the shape of the tendons and ligaments, they simply create directionality inside of an expansion and compression model. And so while we might call it a supinating foot and a plantar flexing ankle, the reality of it is that the constraints of the shape of the objects that make up the ankle, just we express expansion in with the terms that we use to describe how we perceive the ankle and the foot moving, but they're actually still operating under the bigger picture of the domain of expansion. And a pronating foot and a dorsiflexing ankle is the opposite expression, which would be the compression element. So compression and expansion are the background simple rules of movement that everything operates from. And there's just more complex demonstrations of it depending upon the exact configuration of bone shape, articulation shape, contribution of tendon, ligament, bone, cartilage, whatever that might be for the exact, or ball and socket, all of these things. Like they express the presentation of expansion or compression within the model of their shape and design. But it's still a background, more pure rule that these things are actually operating from. Then we have from there, pillar 6 is muscular orientation, that muscles are long or short, or, the words that are used are eccentric or concentric. And so that would mean that there's like a mid-zone length of a muscle. And anytime that, if it's a bicep, like 90 degrees of elbow flexion, as soon as it's a more obtuse angle, the muscle would be going into an eccentric orientation. As soon as it's a more acute angle, it would be more of a concentric orientation. And the final pillar is muscular action, and there's two of those as well. And those are overcoming actions or yielding actions. And generally speaking, yielding is when you're moving in the direction of gravity, and overcoming is when you're going against the direction of gravity. So those are all the different categories, but it's kind of the interplay of those categories where there's utility and use, and really where an exercise is it makes sense. Like it's the code, it's the language that you would use to describe something. And at the end of the description, you probably like pick your tool that you would use to be able to make this thing happen. So before I put all of the combinations together, I'll just simply give let's use the last couple of pillars to show the purpose of this. So you can have a yielding motion that is done from a concentric orientation, and it can be one that like, what does that kind of mean? Like, if you are yielding and the muscle stays concentric, this is essentially what you want to do if you're trying to jump rope and you're landing on the ground. Like, I want to be able to keep my ankle and plantar flexion. I don't really want my heels to be banging on the ground when I'm jumping rope. I want to quickly hit the ground and get off the ground. And if I as I'm hitting the ground, I have to absorb and go in the same direction of gravity, but I don't want to allow the gastroc and the soleus to get long. If I do, that means I've moved into dorsiflexion. So on the flip side, there are some times where I want to be doing a yielding motion and I want to go into an eccentric orientation, such as if I want to squat and do a deep squat. Ultimately in that place, the only way to get low and deep down into a squat would be to allow the quadriceps to go into an eccentric orientation. And if the quadriceps are unable to go into an eccentric orientation, I would never be able to actually reach the bottom of a squat. So from there, it's kind of like, well, let's kind of play this out on a bigger level. If I'm trying to select an exercise, I start with a motor pattern. Let's say I'm starting with a hinge and I want to do the hinge in a bilateral stance and I want it to go in the sagittal plane. Starting to get a picture of what this thing is. Okay. Now I'm going to move into pillar 2, which is movement quantity. And we're going to go with a moderate load at moderate velocity for a moderate duration. So I'm beginning to know, like, okay, well, the weight that I'm going to use is going to be somewhere between 60 and 79% of the 1 rep max. The velocity of the movement is going to be between 0.50 and 0.99 meters per second. The duration is going to be longer than 15 seconds, and it's going to go up to 1 minute and 59 seconds in potential length. Now, when I go off into pillar 3, I know that my skull should be in alignment with my thorax, which should be in alignment with my pelvis. And if I'm doing that, I should feel some weight on my heels, and I should have some level of recruitment of my internal obliques and my hamstrings as anti-gravity muscles. Now I kind of superimpose the muscles that would be the working muscles for a hinge. Okay, so I'd probably get some glutes and some back erectors and lats superimposed on top of that so that I'm able to actually perform the motor pattern. From there, I go into pillar 4, okay? And I would say, okay, this is going to be a high ground exercise. So if I kind of go into like the rungs of like what is a very high ground hinge, what is a high ground hinge, what is a moderate ground hinge, what I see is that, like a barbell would be a high ground hinge. And if I was using a Smith machine, that would be a very high ground hinge. That point of differentiation lets me know the kinds of tools that I would be working with so that I could pick inside of. Like I could use, a Smith machine, or I could use some sort of like, you see them, they almost look like rickshaw machines or something like that in the gym where people can either shrug or hinge with them. So we're not in very high ground, we're in high ground. So it gives you an idea. Some kind of bar or dumbbells would be the tool that you would use in high ground versus very high ground. And from there, we're going to move into pillar 5, which is that, movement strategies and what needs to yield and what needs to compress, or what needs to be expanded and what needs to be compressed. And when I get into hinging, the thing that I discover is that the only way for me to make my pelvis translate posteriorly through space is that I have to reach an eccentric orientation of my posterior pelvic floor while I remain in a concentric orientation of my anterior pelvic floor, which is essentially a compressed anterior pelvis and an expanded posterior pelvis. If I were to flip that arrangement and have a concentric posterior pelvic floor and an eccentric anterior pelvic floor, that would set the stage for me to be able to squat, but not to be able to hinge. And if I understand that there is a certain stereotype of bony movements based around the respiratory patterns of inhalation and exhalation, I begin to understand that the hinge-based pelvic position is an exhaled, compressed skeleton presentation. So if I know what an exhaled skeleton presentation is, I know that that rides along with pronation, dorsiflexion, extension, adduction, internal rotation. So if the person is struggling to do those movements, I can bias their joints towards those positions. So I could potentially take their shoes off if their shoe has too much of a heel lift, or I could elevate their toes a little bit, or I could elevate the lateral part of their foot. And all of those things should bias and help their pelvis move into more of an exhaled, compressed presentation so that I create the right sorts of framework at the level of the musculature of the pelvic floor so that I create the right directional movement to allow the person to do the exercise. And, that basically utilizes all of the pillars and creates as close to a rule book for how to get a successful movement that fits a very specific category to be able to be performed.
I love that. Thank you for that. It's cool to see the idea, the overall concepts, and then how you can actually apply them. And there's, we could drill down into each of the 7 pillars and probably have a separate, full podcast length conversation on each of them. So I will just do my best to drill down selectively here.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot. That's why there's 3 different 2-day seminars, and that's like the 300 plus page book that I wrote for it, and blah blah blah. But ultimately, if you understand the concepts allow you to select, coach, build exercises so that you basically always get the outcome that you want, which is that you set the person up to be able to do exactly the right movement, exactly correct from an execution standpoint. And, I probably have something almost pathologically wrong with my brain where I just hate errors to a point that it just drives me insane. And so I just wanted to build something that would, for someone willing to put the work in to learn, they would always be successful with getting a person to do exactly what they were hoping to do from the perspective of assigning exercise to them.
And on that topic, I love, you and I have both used this metaphor of thinking of exercise like medicine, in the sense that, if you're a physician and someone comes to you with an ailment, I mean, ignoring the, functional medicine and getting to the root cause, and there's better ways to do this. But setting that aside, generally speaking, a physician is going to want to select the right medicine, for the right condition, do it in the right dose, provide it at the right time. And in many ways, exercise can be the same sort of thing. So how, expanding on that a little bit before we drill down into some of the pillars, I guess that is one of the pillars, but expanding on that a little bit, can you describe how specific, there's this, we talk a lot about this specificity of adaptation, neurologically speaking. So how much do you want to match the exercise to, say you're working with an athlete, and you can select whatever sport you want for this example, but say you're working with an athlete, how much are you going to want to select the movements that are very specific to those joint actions, those velocities, those durations, versus more general, or using the old kind of Soviet term, GPP, general preparation, versus SPP, specific preparation, right?
Yeah. So I think that this is very much there's a couple of things to unpack here. One is this exercise as medicine concept. And in a lot of ways, I think of modern medicine it's like approved drug dealing. And so it's, pharmacology is about as big as it gets in medicine right now. And what that's based on is understanding the chemistry needs to match the ailment. And then there's different categories of drugs. The pharmacologist has to learn a tremendous number of categories, and you want to be able to provide a specific drug that belongs to a very specific category and subtype. And what pharmacology is always trying to do is it's trying to make smarter drugs. So it's kind of like, what's a dumb drug and what's a smart drug? A dumb drug is one that it hits the target tissue for a problem. Okay, so let's say we have the problem is prostate. Like there's prostate enlargement and hypertrophy taking place, and they want to create a situation where a drug is used that blunts prostate hypertrophy. Great. So a dumb version of that would be that it binds to the prostate, but a lot of times the problem is that the target cells for the prostate end up also being something that the chemicals that would bind to those would also bind to smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. And so it would affect everything. So it would potentially blunt skeletal muscle hypertrophy and create problems within smooth muscle as well. So you hit the target, but you also hit other cell types and tissue types. And as a result, you have side effects. That's essentially what that is. Drugs hit their primary effect, and then side effects are essentially when the drug interacts with non-target tissue cells and has an effect on those things. Smart drugs interact with the target cells and then tend to interact with fewer non-target tissue cells. And the smartest drug would be one that only interacted with target tissue cells and interacted with no other tissue cells. So over time, chemists and pharmacology is always looking to make it so that there's fewer and fewer adjacent tissue type cells that a chemical would interact with. And, to me, exercise is very, very similar to that, where with a movement, let's say, again, let's just go with hinge, the target tissues for a hinge, hamstrings, glutes, and then, the back erectors, a lot, muscles on the back side of the body. That's great. But if you actually are going to be training a hinge pretty hard, you're going to find like, oh man, like I've also got some joint pain that's riding along with this and just general inflammation. Nobody is training for joint pain and inflammation. Like people are like, well, I'm doing deadlifts because I want my butt to get bigger and my hamstrings to get stronger. And they're not thinking about a lot of the other things. Conventional barbell deadlift off the ground is going to hit everything. It's going to train literally everything from like your forehead to the bottoms of your feet. And that's great in some ways, but there's a lot of non-target tissues that are getting significant stimuli with that. Versus something like a 45-degree hip extension bench would tend to put more stress directly on the glutes and the hamstrings and place a hell of a lot less stress on some of the non-target tissues that a conventional deadlift would put a tremendous amount of stress on. So I think that something along that line of thinking is the way that I usually want to go with people. How can I ultimately hit exactly the target and not necessarily have a lot of ride-alongs go with it? Now, if you're a power lifter, guess what? You have to conventional deadlift. If you're not a power lifter and all you care about is muscle hypertrophy, there's not a need to do any particular exercise other than emotional things that come to people because of our attachments to certain exercises. But in my mind, if I can increase training volume and total stress application towards whatever it is that's the muscles that you're really trying to hypertrophy with less sort of like side effects from training to ride along, I'm actually providing more stimuli to where I'm trying to stimulate, and I'm dropping off a tremendous amount of potential fatigue that could hinder your ability to drive adaptations in a certain place. So I'm always just looking at it like, how do I construct a design to be able to hit certain things in the best way possible that leaves off everything else? And that would give me more of like, I don't know, a targeted approach, but like I really try to leave my emotional connection with exercises aside and evaluate things much more just from like as close to an objective framework as I can possibly get. Because I think that our field is so new that we're really just kind of like, I picture it almost as like Stone Age weapons or something like that, and people arguing over which one's better, and they have no idea that nuclear bombs will exist in the future and like a completely different trajectory. So it's almost like if I just try to picture myself removed from everything, and almost like if I was an outsider just looking at this, like how would I design something with no connection to anything that kind of came before me in some ways. That's just to try to get that point across. Almost like if a medical professional were looking to come in and almost hijack the design of exercise, what would be the framework that they would try to use to make a smarter drug? But the concept is exercise, and exercise, it works very much the same way as administering drugs. Ultimately you have a response, a primary effect, secondary effects, and there's a clear dose response relationship where an underdosing doesn't really accomplish what you need. Proper dosing accomplishes what you need with less side effects. Overdosing creates its own set of problems, but ultimately the dose that is proper now is not going to be the same dose that will be proper 2 weeks from now. There is sort of like a acclimation, or what's the right word? People get used to the same stimulus, and it's a moving target. And so you have to titrate the dosage to be able to match the changing responsiveness of the organism. And so strategically being able to do that is part of the process as well. That I think that sort of tackles that part. And then from the perspective of athletes, different kinds of athletes in different sports, this really goes back to the ground discussion, and trying to categorize different sports on the spectrum of ground, where there's the very low ground sports, the very high ground sports. Very low ground sports in my mind are like diving in the Olympics, and half pipe skateboarding, and maybe surfing, and like half pipe snowboarding. Very high ground sports like powerlifting, interior line play, and football. Those are both very, very high ground sports. And the athletes in those sports are very different. The thing that makes the low ground athletes amazing is they can turn and tumble their bodies through space. And on the complete other end of the spectrum, the high ground athletes are able to prevent themselves from being turned or being tumbled through space by external forces. Everything else is like somewhere in the middle. Okay, so let's say like lacrosse is probably as dead center in the middle as you can get. Basketball, soccer, there are all these sports that are somewhere kind of in the middle. You might be able to have someone that's more of an expert in those sports to be able to give them an exact. If powerlifting is 100 and diving is 0, then maybe lacrosse is a 59.
Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NewFit and the Newbie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.new.fit, that's neu.fit, so you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there.
And what I would do ultimately is, when I'm putting exercise selection together for an athlete, it would try to match the level of ground of the exercises being done with the sport. So, like I said, I have for every movement pattern, I've got my very high ground, I've got very high ground, high, moderate, low, very low ground exercises. And so if I'm able to primarily provide a corresponding level of ground in the exercise, to the matching level of ground in the sport, that would be the majority of the volume that athlete would get for their exercises. From there, they would probably receive some percentage of volume from other ground levels as well. Now, within the model, everyone starts at high ground because those are the easiest things to learn. And then what happens is you systematically strip away ground so that the person remains competent and able to do the exercise proficiently until they arrive at their chute of corresponding ground to sport. From there, like I said, now we get into this level of like probably 75% of their exercises are corresponding ground, and then the remaining 25% is split 12 and a half high ground, 12.5% low ground.
Awesome. That's a great description. I appreciate you going into such depth on the notion of smart drugs and dumb drugs and relating that to exercise. I think that really landed for me. I imagine it will for many people listening to this. And then that also makes sense in terms of how you would apply it to certain athletes. Also, for our community, I will mention this notion of ground is external reference and feedback that helps ensure that you hit the target tissue and use the right muscles to complete the movements and everything. And so, you can certainly think of the newbie, the afferent feedback of that direct current as a form of ground or reference that can increase the likelihood. I mean, we talk about that often of using this input to ensure, or at least make it as likely as possible, that the person is going to be using the correct muscles to complete the movement, complete the task at hand, limiting as much as we can compensatory movements, especially the guarding and protective patterns that happen in response to injury. So I think it's really cool because our work can fit within this framework. I mean, if you're going to have a grand unified field theory, things that other people are doing have to be able to fit inside of it. And I'm glad
to be able to fit. Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's just sort of mutual validation there that kind of works well together. There's again all these pillars. I'm just going to touch on a couple different points along the way. Another one is the notion of expansion and compression is something that really also landed with me, and it sort of simplifies. Look, I can see someone looking at this 7 pillars, all these different exercises. It can seem kind of overwhelming, and yet that felt to me like a really wonderfully simplifying, clarifying concept to be able to essentially categorize all movements in one of 2 categories, looking at supination, expansion, flexion, and then vice versa, compression, pronation, extension, etc. So that actually is a really cool framework there that I liked. So just touching on a few things. You talked about breathing. I do want to get into that. Also, though, while we're still sort of talking about some of the philosophy, your seminar series is called Rethinking the Big Patterns. So you've already talked about hinge, talked about breathing, so some of them, but can you tell us from your perspective, what are the big patterns and in what way are you rethinking them?
So this is like the motor patterns. It's like literally, it's pillar 1, topic 1 is motor patterns. And I've got 13 motor patterns that I think are the available trainable menu of things that humans do from a fitness perspective. And I'm always looking for other motor patterns. I've had people try to present me with some, but I'm like, I think that actually lives inside the ones already existing. So the 13 I've got are breathing, core exercises for the pelvis, core exercises for the thorax. And those 3 are part of what I teach as control patterns, which is the seminar that I taught that you attended. Then there is hinge, squat, horizontal push, horizontal pull, vertical push, vertical pull. And that group is what makes up the resistance pattern seminar that I teach. It's basically lifting weights. And from there, the last group are change of direction, throwing, locomotion, and triple extension. So that last group is what I refer to as athletic patterns that makes its own 3rd seminar. And so, I try to essentially say that, like, I try to define people as well, like potential clients that you could work with, and say which patterns are dominant for those groups. And, I have general population, which is personal training. And most people coming in for personal training are looking for the combination of health and aesthetics. So, interesting to me, like health, I really kind of define as VO2 max, muscle tissue, and fat tissue. So, you want a high VO2 max, a high level of muscle tissue, and a low level of fat tissue. And if we have that, we're probably checking the biggest boxes available to us on the fitness end for that which would correspond to health. And so, the motor patterns that are dominant for general population personal training are the resistance pattern and locomotion. And I try to, again, constraints, like what are the boundaries? Like, I generally, those are the boundaries for motor patterns. And then for those motor patterns, sagittal plane and bilateral stance and front back stance. And that's pretty much the whole playbook for lifting weights for me for personal training. You can, and again, like when I say these things, it's the same thing as ground, where in the ground thing, I was like, well, about 75% of the volume should probably be at the same level of ground for exercises. And then you can spread it out. The same thing to me for personal training. At least 75% should be in that very tight playbook of resistance patterns, sagittal plane, bilateral stance, front back stance. You're like, that's not a lot, is it? Like, we just do compound lifts in a sagittal plane in the front and in a bilateral stance in the front back stance. That's the whole thing. And then you do locomotion, and you do that like for moderate velocity, moderate duration, moderate everything. Like, yeah, basically you lift weights and you do cardio. That's how you build VO2 muscle tissue and put them on a diet for fat tissue. That is going to capture their results. And then you can use the remainder as like the emotional needs of the person for whatever their particular feelings are regarding movement and training, et cetera, et cetera. But I also have athletes I could potentially work with. And for the majority of sports, the most dominant motor patterns are locomotion, change of direction, throwing, and triple extension. So, that's the meat and potatoes for that population. And the third group is going to be special populations. And those would be people that could potentially have orthopedic conditions or metabolic conditions. And when I think metabolic conditions, like the primary one I'm usually thinking of is asthma or some other kind of breathing based thing. But if you have an orthopedic condition or some kind of respiratory condition, the primary motor patterns are going to be breathing and core exercises. And my goal is to move you from special populations into either general population or athletic population. I just want to move you back where you should be. And that is typically the removal of orthopedic problems. And I accomplish that through the core exercises and breathing strategies. And once we've done that, then you get to play back in the group that you want to be in.
And even for someone who may not have a diagnosis that has it in the special population, someone coming in, to work with you, or someone who's trained in your methods, likely would start even start in the breathing, core pelvis, core thorax, right? And just to gain proficiency.
I typically, with general population personal training, I have this Outback Steakhouse analogy that I oftentimes talk about. Like, I like the Outback Steakhouse, and if I go there, I kind of know what I want before I even sit down. Like, I know that I'm going to get the ribeye, I'm going to get the sweet potato with brown sugar and butter, and I'm going to get the broccoli with melted cheese on it. Like, I'm going to get this thing, okay? But imagine I have sort of this rogue waiter that comes over and they're like, sir, I'm actually an expert in male health, and it's very common that iron levels and ferritin levels are elevated for a man that fits your demographic description. And as a result of that, red meat's going to be out for you today. And I've already prepared for you like the tofu delight. Like, this is so far against my expectations that I feel violated at this point in time. And I'm never going back again. And so I just try to picture myself in the shoes of like somebody that's coming to the gym that doesn't know anything about my weird world or any other weird world. And they're just like, yeah, I want to come in and get a workout and I want to sweat and I want to push and I want to get back in shape. And they don't, like I would probably violate their assumptions of what that is by like putting them on the ground and having them breathe. So for personal training for their goals, I just use very high ground exercises to be able to teach proficiencies. It accomplishes everything I want with the least amount of assumption violations about what the environmental experience should be for that person. Um, and if it's athletes, again, it's kind of like somebody better be asking me for that specifically, or if they might be in special populations where they've got an issue. But if they're a healthy young athlete, I'm probably going to violate their expectations of what training are by putting them on the ground and having them do all this sort of stuff on day one and like intricately finding an adductor. I really don't want to do that. And I don't want to create a problem where there isn't one either. I think that good exercise selection and utilizing the concepts of ground to teach really great execution of concepts and initial stages is how I approach it. And so right tool for the right population at the right time is how I go about that.
Okay, that makes sense. I appreciate that Outback Steakhouse metaphor. And for everyone, we have a mix of people listening to this. Some are going to be more on the athletic performance side, and then many are going to be physical therapists, chiropractors. They're going to be working in the special population side because they're going to have people who have injuries. So at least temporarily they're there until they recover and can join the other group of general population or athletic population. So that's a great perspective. I appreciate you sharing that. Since we do have a large mix of people who are going to be dealing with the injured population, many of them would start in that, breathing, pelvis,
Yep.
thorax control pattern type of scenario. So
And again, if I've got someone coming in and that is their presentation, that's where I start as well. It's just the presence of pathology dictates, the route that I'm going to take. And in terms of starting with breathing and core or fitness.
mhm. So that makes a lot of sense. So then starting at the beginning for those people in that pathological injury presentation, since we are starting there, can you talk about this notion of infrasternal angle and how that
Yeah.
relates to breathing and associated compensations there? Because I think that's sort of a good avenue into this discussion. And I love your description here, and I think that can really tie some of these concepts together.
Yeah, and I want to just take a second, just acknowledge Bill Hartman as like the source for a lot of these concepts too. For pillars 5, 6, and 7, movement strategies, muscle orientation, muscle action. That's Bill Hartman 101. Okay, and Bill has probably been the biggest point of information for me to be able to put this stuff together of anybody that exists. And, when it comes to infrasternal angle, this is another Bill Hartman direct topic. So for people that are looking for the source, that's the source for this stuff. And Bill's got a tremendous number of resources, and he is the man. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due, and people aren't thinking like, "Wow, I came up with," because I didn't come up with those pieces. I come up with some other parts. The ground thing is my world, and these categories are my world. I'm a model builder, but Bill's a genius, and Bill is the person that kind of like these concepts are coming from.
And
With
he's in Indianapolis, right? He's at the IFAST.
that's right, yeah. And with understanding the skeleton as like the primary backdrop of our movement potential, skeletons move. They have distinct, joint actions, and that these joint actions, there's one group of joint actions that fall under the topic of compression joint actions and another that fall under expansion joint actions, and they're stereotypical. So, with expansion, you've got flexion, abduction, external rotation, plantar flexion, supination as your big five joint actions. And that gets coupled with respiratory action of inhalation. Okay, so uh, on the other side, you've got the exact mirror opposite joint actions and respiratory action. So compression is extension, adduction, internal rotation, dorsiflexion, pronation, and exhalation. And this, every level, like when we're talking about the rib cage moving during breathing, when you're exhaling, your rib cage is adducting and it's internally rotating. That's the actions that you'll see. Kind of the sternal ribs are primarily going to be internally rotating, and you can see those lower infrasternal ribs. We give the terms of pump handle breathing at the sternum and bucket handle breathing at the infrasternal ribs, and it's bucket handle down on exhalation and bucket handle up on inhalation, and sternal pump handle down on exhalation and pump handle up on inhalation. But, to me, bucket handle down is pretty damn close to adduction, and bucket handle up is abduction, and pump handle down is internal rotation, and pump handle up is external rotation. You could probably make a pretty good case for extension and flexion. It's just we kind of pick some arbitrary terms sometimes, but you do see some like individual, almost like you know rotary action at the ribs as well, within their little their articulations and points of contact. So, anyways, there are stereotypical movements that take place when we breathe. Like inhalation is going to be diaphragm droppings, more space in the chest cavity. Air comes in, it expands the chest cavity, it expands the rib cage. But generally speaking, we see the sternum and the sternal ribs pump handle up. They basically are flexing, externally rotating, abducting, the whole thing that would ride along with that. And on the exhalation, compressing and IRing, extending, adducting, pushing air out. Diaphragm is going to redome, take up more space. That's what normally happens. We should see a fairly uniform stereotype of these things. And we'd see a stereotype everywhere through the body. Okay, every single bone moves to some degree during breath cycles. And when breath cycles get really aggressive with things like maximal exercise, you see just how much movement takes place through the body to help move air. Eyeballs will move, the neck moves, the cranium moves, the feet move, blah, 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 blah. So with any movement, there is the potential for compensation. And the easiest place in the body to compensate are the places that have very malleable bones and joints. Okay, so the infrasternal ribs are about as malleable a set of bones as you can find in your body. Like you can push on those ribs, you feel them deform under very little hand pressure. It really just shows how easy it is to move those bones. If you were to compare that with trying to, push your teeth around, your teeth are not particularly malleable, and it would be hard to, look, like we see though, dental presentations, like you can spot a mouth breather by the shape that their teeth have taken. So you can see how much respiration and air movement ultimately acts as almost like waves against a mountain, molding the physical presentation of these structures. But the first place, it's almost like the original sin compensation, is the infrasternal angle that we see in a person. So when someone is biased towards compression, okay, they're very good at being able to IR and exhale and push air out. Usually they're compressed everywhere excessively. Like the pelvis is compressed, the sternum is compressed, the on and on and on is compressed. But you have to breathe. You have to go through the full cycle of ventilation or you will die. So they manage to find the path of least resistance to expand. And the easiest path of resistance is the infrasternal ribs. And what you'll see is that that person will present a very bucket handle up constant presentation, which is a wide infrasternal angle. And that's basically where they're getting their expansion from. That's, just what it is. It's a compensatory expansion that is the result of the overall skeleton being biased excessively towards compression. And the exact opposite can take place when we see a very narrow infrasternal angle, where this person is excellent with expansion. Their sternum is expanded, their pelvis is expanded, everywhere is expanded, and their path of least resistance to create compression is through the infrasternal ribs, and that's basically the only place that they're getting their compression from. So the infrasternal presentation is the compensation that tells you what their overall bias is.
And for me, one of the things that, the first time I heard this and then was trying to sort of feel the effects in my own breathing, a few different things helped me get it. One was thinking about what's happening at the spine and how that compression there, kind of horizontal compression and pressure from the spine in different phases of breathing. That helped me a lot. So for instance, if the spine is pressing forward, that's going to be creating compression. So if you're getting into a more lordotic spine, lumbar spine, whereas if you inhale and expand and the lumbar spine flexes a little bit, reducing the lordotic curve, that actually is expansionary. So I'm just sharing that in case that helps clarify concepts in people's minds here. But it's something that I think is also worth feeling, going through breathing and feeling that expansion and compression happen. And then it's interesting to think about that perspective. I want to use this as a little segue here too, where you talk about if someone tends to compress in one area, the expansion of that part of the ribs is essentially the compensation, because that's the only place where they're able to regularly get expansion in a bias towards global compression. And so kind of feeding them the opposite is the corrective measure there. And you also talk about, and you've gone into this categorizing movements in terms of yielding and overcoming, eccentric, concentric. You talk about in several places this notion that certain types of movements can inoculate against injury in other domains, or training agonists and antagonists. Training the antagonist musculature can help, or training in certain domains. So there's some sort of connection there in the thought process of giving someone, if someone is showing something in one area, you're sort of giving them the opposite. Can you talk about that from the perspective of those similar principles, analogous principles in terms of inoculation against injury and some other things that can then apply? This obviously breathing here, we're talking about the special population, overcoming injury, and applying similar concepts in the athletic population.
Yeah, I'd be thrilled to. And to me, the fun part of all of this is, after you've been able to tackle each individual pillar, the way that you can play with the integration of the pillars is where it gets fun. And, that's what I'm always trying to do. And I'm planning on writing a follow-up second book to the first one. And this is a concept I've been teaching in seminars, but I haven't yet put in a book that I've published. And it's this it's another interaction concept. So it's the interaction between movement velocity, resistance moment arm length, and muscle orientation. So resistance moment arm length is a traditional biomechanics concept, and it is the horizontal distance between the fulcrum, the joint, the center of rotation, and the external load that's being placed on the body. So what this means is, like, if you're doing a biceps curl, the center of rotation is the elbow joint, and then depending upon where you are in the curl is the horizontal distance between the load and the center of rotation of the elbow. So if you're standing and doing a barbell curl, at the top, the weight is horizontally basically right over the elbow. At the very bottom of the exercise, the weight is horizontally right under the elbow. So there's virtually no horizontal distance between the load and the center of rotation. Versus at 90 degrees of the motion, this is the point where there's the greatest horizontal distance between the load and the rotation point. And what this is it's a presentation of torque, because torque is the load times the horizontal distance from the rotation point. And muscles don't respond to load, muscles respond to torque. And so you have to always be aware of, like, when you're doing a movement, what is the resistance moment arm that is taking place at any point in time. And for this will, if you're moving fast and you have a large resistance moment arm and the muscle is in a stretched position, that's basically the position that people get into when they get hurt. Okay. It's sort of like when a quarterback is going to throw the ball and he's open and just starting to move, and a defensive player hits him like on the front side of the elbow. And it's like, oh no, the guy just, tore his pec or tore the UCL in his elbow, or something's got to go. It's kind of like when Brock Purdy got knocked out of the playoffs a couple of years ago, and it ended up being his elbow that he had to have surgically repaired. Or when people pull their hamstrings in sprinting, it's usually because their foot lands out in front of their center of mass. And, good sprinting technique involves the foot landing directly under the center of mass as the person's running. When people get tired, their technique breaks down, or they just have bad technique and their foot lands way out in front of them. And this creates a large resistance moment arm at high velocity with the hamstring in a stretched position. So, boom, that's kind of like what takes place. There's a like I created like a, what was we calling it, like an octrant. It's an eight. It's 8 boxes basically. It's not a quadrant. It's double that. So you can see that there's these combinations of, like, okay, we have slow movements with concentric muscle orientation and short resistance moment arms. And then there's slow movements with eccentric and short resistance moment arms. And if you go through it, there's every combination of those things. And each one of those boxes has things that kind of fall under its domain. And, as I was alluding to, this box of, it's a fast movement with an eccentric oriented muscle, and it is a large resistance moment arm. This is the danger zone. This is like the blinking red light in an 80s movie. Don't hit that button on the computer or the world is going to end. That's that box. And so we're always worried about that one. And I think that there's interactions between these different boxes. So the other box of interest for that particular box is slow movement with an eccentric oriented muscle and a large resistance moment arm. Okay. And this would be like a Nordic, for instance, falls under that box. Okay. Like, as the person is lowering themselves in the Nordic, they're going into more knee extension, which would be more of an eccentric oriented hamstring. And as they're lowering their body weight, more of the load is horizontally moving away from the center of rotation at the knee. So you're increasing the load as the resistance moment arm increases. So that would be a profile that increases stress on the muscle as the muscle is being stretched more and more and more. And that's an interesting box that's being found in the literature right now on hypertrophy as being like, this is the money box. Okay, so there's a lot of research right now on lengthened partials versus full range versus shortened partial exercises. And it's basically showing that shortened position partial movements are not good for promoting hypertrophy. They're the worst choice you could have. And full range of motion usually is not any better than lengthened partial versions of an exercise. So it seems as though maybe it's just the lengthened partial part of a resistance exercise that actually promotes the growth and hypertrophy response for the target tissues. Now, what's interesting is that information was then superimposed on some other studies that play with resistance profiles. So a resistance profile is essentially asking the question of where is the most stressful part of the exercise? In the short position of the muscle, the mid-length position of the muscle, or the lengthened position of the muscle? The first study that I saw on this was with biceps curls, and they compared an incline bench curl to a preacher curl. So with an incline bench curl, you're leaning back into the incline and your arm is straight down by your side. So in the stretched position of that exercise, the load is horizontally directly below the elbow joint. So there's essentially no torque at length. With a preacher curl, as you're lowering the dumbbell horizontally keeps moving further and further away from the joint. So as you're lengthening the biceps, the torque is increasing on the biceps. The preacher curl won from a hypertrophy response at a statistically significant level compared to the incline bench curl. And I think that we're seeing this concept just it's kind of like, hey, this is why squats work. This is why RDLs work. Because as I'm lowering myself in a squat, the weight stays right over my midfoot, but my knees and my hips are horizontally moving away from midfoot. Therefore, the deeper I squat, the greater the resistance moment arm as a result of the horizontal displacement of the joints. And so as I descend, the target tissues of the glutes and the quads are getting stretched more and more and more on a squat. And it's the same profile of increasing stretch with increasing resistance moment arm. And there is a tissue response that takes place with that particular category of exercise. And what I think is going to emerge based on kind of like the Nordics and the Copenhagen research as it pertains to hamstring injuries in sprinting and, groins in hockey and things like that, is that there's no magic to a Nordic and there's no magic to a Copenhagen. They're just simply good ways to be able to provide a high level of stretched stress to a tissue. And if you do that, you're probably giving it some sort of an inoculation effect for the higher velocity movements that incorporate stretched stress.
I appreciate that. That's an excellent description there. And I think that we'll probably land for people in terms of understanding why some of these exercises, like you said, the Nordic or like the squat sort of explains it. And again, it ties back into the pillars of movement and the categories and all these different things too. So I just also want to connect the dots that it's a good way to apply the model that we talked about on the front end of this conversation, and another way to categorize these movements, and one that I think is very useful, especially in that athletic population for injury, reducing risk of injury, but also, like you mentioned, hypertrophy for general population and personal training clients. That's one of the big goals, is body composition. So that's really good to know. And there's some other examples that you shared, of how one might apply that I've been doing even in the last week or so. Is like if you were going to do a dumbbell raise, for example, with your shoulder, same thing. If you're doing just holding a dumbbell at your side, when the deltoid muscles are at their greatest length, the resistance moment arm is at its is least, and then the resistance moment arm increases as you get up to the shorter muscle length. So being able to use a cable, for example, across your body and apply that moment arm and increase the torque when the deltoid muscle is at greater muscle lengths, at longer lengths, is a very useful thing. So there's other ways to take these concepts and apply them, and I appreciate the description there. In terms of all these different, we're getting to touch on a few different pillars. I would like to see if we can touch on one more before we wind down the conversation.
Yeah.
And that is, I loved your description. You already touched on it here today too. Touched on this notion of movement competencies. So there are specific competencies that you describe in the 3 planes of motion, and I want to see if we can at least introduce everyone listening to this to those topics, because I think it's really valuable to understand there are clear competencies and boxes we need to check in one plane before moving on and training the next one, to make sure that there's objective things that we can objective measures we can have to grade movement as effective and efficient or not. And I thought this was a really valuable concept. So I think perhaps that can be sort of the last pillar we visit.
Love to. This one, whenever I get to dive in on this one a little bit, it's like this to me is the nastiest can of worms inside the whole thing, believe it or not. And I always think back to the FMS with this and Gray Cook's concepts, and I loved Gray Cook's book, Athletic Body in Balance. And I love listening to Gray Cook. I think Gray Cook's ideas about why he created the functional movement screen are fantastic. I think that, Gray Cook really could have, he fell victim to the same thing that a lot of people have fallen victim to over the years, which is that Socrates kind of got him. Okay, what do I mean by this? What Socrates was put to death for is something that a lot of people don't really understand. Okay, they always hear like, oh, he was poisoning the minds of the youth, and that's why they made him drink the hemlock. Like you've probably heard that on some level, and like we just like it's like in one ear out the other. What the hell does that actually mean? Well, what Socrates' main thing was that got him killed was that the sophists were the kind of like historical Greek scholars and the branch of philosophers that existed. And Plato kind of towed the line between sophists and Socrates, because Plato, a lot of what Plato wrote about was this other realm, this perfect realm that we all descended from, that we're all trying to get back to. And in that perfect realm, there's the concepts for the things that exist in Earth. So there's the perfect circle, and like every circle that we try to create on Earth is always imperfect. And there's like the perfect tree, and every tree on Earth attempts to be the perfect tree, but it always falls short. And so it's the realm of perfection, and everything on Earth is a modeled representation of the perfection from this external other realm that we're from and always trying to return back to. But the sophists kind of believed in this idea, and the sophists were obsessed with trying to discover the good, is kind of what our closest translation is for it. And Socrates basically came along and said that there's no such thing as this notion of the good. and he asked people to try to define good, and it's still impossible to do. Like any definition that you try to come up with, you can't even really do it. He actually kind of like created a real problem for people from a thought process perspective, because it's kind of like, well, you know it when you see it. You know, what is good? It's. I know that that's bad and that that's good. So trying to actually define what is good is like impossible. And Socrates laid the foundation for reductionist thinking and the demarcation or the bifurcation between topics of it's either this or it's that. And reductionism just, becomes more complex and is the sort of foundation of the empirical model in a lot of ways that later Da Vinci made much more of what the modern presentation actually is. But Socrates basically discredited this concept of the good or qualitative and drove us down this road towards quantitative and more of like the only way that you can measure something is through objective approaches, and even qualitative research ultimately has to be turned into a quantitative paper and pencil sort of a thing. You can't just describe something and that's the end of it. You have to try to measure something to make it useful and utilitarian. And the sophists hated him so much for this that they put him to death. But the problem is that he was annoyingly right. So the minute that you try to create something that defines and measures good movement, you're running into the same problem that Socrates started to point out. And it's, so I'm kind of like aware of this concept of like, if I'm going to try to define good movement, I'm ultimately taking on Socrates. And that's a losing battle for literally every person in history since Socrates existed. But fuck it. Let me get in the ring and take my swings. And so what I did was I actually took a concept that's from the 1850s, and it's something called Jacksonian dissolution. And there was an English neurobiologist, John Hewlings Jackson, in the 1850s. And what he noticed was that the human brain will begin to inhibit its most modern anatomical pieces when it's confronted with stress. So the most modern part of your brain is the prefrontal cortex. But when you're experiencing a stressful situation, your prefrontal cortex goes offline and you begin to use older parts of your brain to function under those circumstances. And older parts are they have less options, but they're more stereotypical. So you know when someone's stressed out, you know what I mean? They're usually operating more from an autonomic driven place, and it's sympathetic, and there's usually some amygdala contributions. So it's like you're like, okay, I'm going to stay away from this person. They're freaking out. All right, and interestingly enough, the concept Jackson called it Jacksonian dissolution. Essentially, you dissolve the modern pieces with stress application, and the more stress, the further back you go from an evolutionary timeline of anatomical, apparatuses, and that's true on every level of tissue types. Okay, whenever a tissue, all of our tissues in our body have undergone their own evolution that has led to our modern presentation as Homo sapiens. And whenever those tissues are stressed, they go to an older model. And it's true of energy systems as well. Our most modern energy system is the aerobic system. When you're under more exercise stress, the glycolytic system begins to dominate as the aerobic system can't hang with that level of stress. And finally, with the most stressful exercise, it's the phosphagen system that you have to rely on. So, I just simply looked at the evolutionary history of movement. And the evolutionary history of movement basically goes from like amoeba type movement of pure expansion compression, of like it compresses over here and expands over here and it pushes itself away from wherever it compresses. Squish, move. And then, like, just to press fast forward on the movement history timeline, we kind of get into the water and we see animals with a backbone evolve, aka fish, and fish move through water with a frontal plane strategy. All right, they just swim in the frontal plane. Press fast forward again, you see fish kind of move onto land, amphibians, and ultimately lizards and reptiles are on land. And these animals are moving on land with a frontal plane spinal engine strategy. Press fast forward again. Let's move forward into the time period of mammals. Mammals made the giant movement evolutionary step of a sagittal plane spinal engine. So they run with a flexion extension dominance with their presentation. Now, some of those mammals actually went back into the ocean. Some like, bovine type animals went back in and became dolphins and whales. And what's interesting is if you watch dolphins and whales in the water, they're essentially using mammalian running to swim in the water. Okay, they have a sagittal plane swimming style. And what's interesting is it's almost like snakes are swimming on land and dolphins and whales are running in the ocean. And it kind of works, all right? If we just continue to press fast forward, we're going to just watch mammals go and turn into apes, and apes go and turn into, the Homo genus. And we're going to see this movement towards bipedalism. And with bipedalism came the transverse plane of real movement presentation, which is what modern Homo sapien does. We have a twisting transverse pelvis and thorax model that we use. And when we are at our best, we're able to walk on 2 feet and remain in between our 2 bases of support, our feet. Our center of mass stays between those things, and our thorax twists back and forth as our pelvis twists in the contralateral direction of our thorax during bipedal human gait. Now, when a human is overwhelmed by stress and their movement system is incapable of keeping up with that stress, what's interesting is we go backwards from an evolutionary timeline perspective, and we try to use a frontal plane strategy to move on 2 feet through land. Okay. And what's interesting is if you simply go back through our own timeline of species evolution, or if you want to take a look at our closest ancestor, a chimpanzee, if you take a chimpanzee and you put them up on 2 feet, a chimpanzee doesn't have the same adaptations and evolutionary drive that we took to become bipedal. A chimpanzee is incapable of competent bipedal gait. It's not able to do a transverse plane motion. What it will do is it has to compensate and move in the frontal plane. If you think about like a chimp, it just rocks back and forth. A penguin also lacks the transverse plane and has to rock back and forth on 2 legs. It's the only way it's able to move on 2 feet. So it's there is a predictable stereotype of the way that movement will go wrong, and it is a Jacksonian dissolution based concept. And you just simply have to look at the evolutionary timeline of movement and see that you will always attempt to swim on land when your movement capabilities are incompetent for the task demands that are being placed upon you. You'll resort to the frontal plane because your sagittal plane is actually inadequate to allow for a transverse plane to emerge in a bipedal setting. So the solution that I always go with to observing any kind of incompetency is to address the center of mass in the sagittal plane. And by typically the center of mass is lost in a forward direction.
So just to clarify, make sure everyone's following along. So sagittal plane, is going to mean you're looking at someone from the side. Center of mass is how forward or backward they are. Just to make sure
Correct.
everyone's following.
Yes. Typically, the center of mass is lost forward, and this is because we've evolved from quadrupedal animals, and a chimpanzee is essentially a glorified quadruped. So the tendency is to always slip backwards in time, evolutionary-wise, with the errors that we commit from a movement perspective. And, I use table tests to see how, deficient someone's movement potential is. If you're really outside the rungs of human norms for your table test measures for how far joints are supposed to move, the thing that immediately pops in my mind is that the sagittal plane center of mass has been lost from where it should be for a human, and it's probably devolved into being more of a chimpanzee presentation of center of mass. And my primary goal at this point in time is to retract the center of mass, pull it back. And when I pull it back, the things that emerge typically is I get more curvature through the spine, and I get more activation through the hamstring. I get more activation through the internal oblique. And all of a sudden, the arms and legs swing as they should for a human. And now the transverse plane begins to emerge with the person in a bipedal situation trying to move forward through space.
I love that. That's a beautiful description, and I think it's cool to tie it together to Socrates. But I think that concept of evolutionarily adding these planes of motion and the Jacksonian dissolution moving backwards is just a beautiful concept.
I would love to have the conversation with Socrates on this, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, right.
That would be the thing I would want, because I don't think I'm wrong. You know what I mean? I really don't think I'm wrong. And I'm sure that Socrates is a hell of a lot smarter than I am. And so it would be really interesting to have him with his thought process on trying to qualify good versus bad. I try to be very careful with this, where it's almost more modern versus old. And it's not that old is bad. Old is actually appropriate. It matches the stress that your system is under due to its interaction with the environment.
Yeah. And then also in terms of older thinking of Socrates, Naval Ravikant has a great quote, something to the effect of, if you are trying to solve an older problem, use an older book. So in other words, some of these spiritual questions that we wrestle with, the meaning of life and happiness and things like that, these are old human problems.
Mm-hmm.
These older spiritual texts can be great places to look. Whereas something that's a newer problem, like electrical engineering and the internet, obviously we're going to need newer texts for that. But sort of just reminds me of that concept. You talked about controlling the center of mass in the sagittal plane, forward and back. So we're losing it forward, have to pull it back. And that, I think, is a good, clear, you see vertical stacking of the head over the thorax, over the pelvis is sort of the guideline to look for there, right?
Yeah.
And then can you just talk briefly about alignment, the analogous checklist for the frontal plane?
Yeah. And it's interesting because, even in the sagittal plane, if it's just you're looking at the person from the side and it's plumb line, that's not the end all be all, because there's a million different ways that people can get to a stacked plumb line. You also have to have this sensory correspondence of like, hey, the thing that's holding your pelvis dead center is your hamstrings. And the thing that's holding your thorax dead center is your internal obliques. And if it's those things, and like you're doing some kind of an exercise setup and you're telling me, my hamstrings are I feel them in my well, yeah, the little sidewall pieces of my abs. Yeah, I feel them. I start to feel more confident that your center of mass is aligned for pelvis and thorax. It's like I need a convergence of data and not a singular data point to help me believe in an idea. Um, and so there's also other checklists for frontal plane that you just pointed out, and frontal plane is the other center of mass one. It's just simply a side to side center of mass rather than a front to back center of mass. And what I think of is like the midline of your body and skull midline. So your nose, your sternum, your belly button, your zipper, that's kind of your body's midline. And can you take that midline and shift it uniformly over each foot? Can you shift it completely over the left foot, completely over the right foot? And we had a lot of fun in this one with the two David statues. Michelangelo's and what was the other guy's name? Now that I can't.
Bernini.
Bernini, or the Bernini David, and the Michelangelo David is like this perfect lateralized center of mass, and the Bernini David is like he's got his head hunting and his pelvis fishing, and it's like okay, this is maybe the difference in the artists as well, but like the Bernini David is not frontal plane competent, and the Michelangelo David is perfectly frontal plane competent, where you can see that he has uniformly shifted the center of mass over his right foot. And whenever that takes place, it creates this unbelievable level of like mirroring on the two sides of the body. Okay. And you can see like Michelangelo's David has this pronated left foot and a supinated right foot, and his left femur is IR'd and his right femur is ER'ing, and his left innominate bone is descended and his right innominate bone is ascended. His left rib cage is ascended and his right rib cage is descended, and his right occiput is ascended as his left occiput is descended. And when you see this kind of like chunk, 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 like oppositional seesaws at the different levels of the axial skeleton and oppositional rotation at the level of the lower extremity, that's what you need to be able to lateralize the body over each base of support. And when you do that, you're playing with potential and kinetic energy. Like for me to be able to, like the human moves through space by manipulating potential and kinetic energy. Like as I land and load on my right foot in mid stance, this is the time where the center of mass from a frontal plane perspective has reached its highest point over here on the right, and I'm going to swing it and drive it back over to the other side. It's almost like a ship on a wave, or like, if you ever seen the pirate ship at the amusement park, like it's going to swing way over here to the right. It's going to get real high, and then basically the compression part is pushing down here, and then it sort of expands up on the other side, and it's going to compress and push down, and it's I kind of said it wrong with the mid. It's like early stance way up high, and then mid stance compress, and I'm going to push the other way, and early stance way up high, and poof, poof, poof. I'm able to manipulate these things, and my joints all correspond exactly perfectly. If my sagittal plane is aligned as it should be in a really good human presentation of being in the middle, I'm able to manipulate the frontal plane, potential energy coming up high, swinging it on down through with compression, and then regathering potential energy, shoom, shoom, shoom. And it's such an efficient, beautiful model that really maximizes energy conservation in like kind of incredible ways.
Yeah, I love it. This, if you read a kinesiology textbook and just learn the joint and muscle actions, you kind of have the letters to be able to form the words, but your model and this description of movement for me is the most effective way that I've seen to really frame it up and put those words together into sentences and paragraphs in ways where we can actually, create beautiful movement or beautiful prose, whatever the metaphor might be there. So, we started with the grand unified field, theory. We started with the big concepts, got to drill down into a couple of them here. As we wind down, I will mention that you are going to be here in Austin in early December for a seminar. So if people wish to drill down any deeper on some of these topics, we're going to be actually hosting that, which I'm really excited for. It should be very fun. Early December here, 2024. And if people are interested in seeing more of your content, learning more about what you're up to, I know you're on Instagram a lot, Dr. Pat Davidson.
Yep.
And then can you talk about your website? Can people buy that book, The Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement? What tell us about the best ways to interact with your content too?
Yeah, I think that, if you're familiar with going to Instagram and then like on someone's page, you get the bio link and there's a link tree. So boom, you click that and it just takes you all the things that I've done. And so, it'll be whatever upcoming seminars are there. I've written the book that corresponds to this seminar series, and the book is called A Coach's Guide to Optimizing Movement, and the subtitle is Rethinking the Big Patterns. I have online training. I have a different thing, Athletic Weapon, which is a training system that you can follow. That's been, it's actually my training. Like, you can do the same training I've been doing for the last 3 years plus, all recorded and written out and put into training blocks and on and on and on. I've got a couple of training books that I wrote in the past. There's a lot of stuff, whatever people want to kind of get into, it's all available there. There is an exercise database for all of the exercises within the Rethinking the Big Patterns model that are videoed and kind of laid out for you to be able to check out. And you'll see that it's kind of the language of the model, where it's like, okay, this is these are the hip dominant exercises in the sagittal plane with a bilateral stance and the, blah, 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 blah. So it tries to show the end products of the descriptive model that's given for you here.
That's awesome. Yes, definitely for anyone who wants a deeper dive, worth checking out. And speaking of, following along with your training, so for people who are watching this, they can obviously tell you've got quite a bit of muscle, but for people listening, they may not know. So can you tell us about your recent focus here in bodybuilding?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I've done a lot of different sports, and now I'm kind of getting into bodybuilding, which is it seems divergent for me, but in the past, like, I've competed professionally in mixed martial arts. I've done submission wrestling and jiu-jitsu. I've done strongman. I competed for multiple world championships in strongman, and I've trained as a sprinter. I've done a lot of different things, and now I'm competing in bodybuilding, which has its own story and backstory. But it's I still do it my way. Like, I'm still going to sprint. I'm still going to do some other athletic stuff. But my primary goal is I want to become an IFBB pro in bodybuilding, and I'd like to compete on big pro stages. And I basically am kind of looking at it like I'm in my mid 40s at this point. Like, this is probably the best fit for me right now to be able to compete at a high level in something. And, I've got all of the experience with training, the knowledge, the discipline. I understand diet stuff as well. And I like to compete. Like, that's really it. Like, I love competing. I love pushing myself to levels that I didn't think were possible. I don't know if how many people read David Goggins' second book, but the end of that book, I found such a connection with, where he was telling the story about the guy that was the first person to go into space. And, in that, it was a guy that just went into a hot air balloon, not an astronaut. He went in a hot air balloon, and this man took the hot air balloon all the way up past the atmosphere and went into space. and then just jumped out of it and parachuted back down to the planet, landed, lit up a cigarette, and walked off. And the title of that chapter is the blue to black line. And it was just like, hey, some people, for whatever reason, this guy just decided he wanted to cross that blue to black line, and nobody knew what would happen. He didn't know what would happen, but he just wanted to see, like, what happens when you go somewhere that no one's ever gone before. But I think in my life, like, there's places I've never gone before. I'd never pushed myself to a level of body composition that I got to last year. I'd never been, but like I ended up at around 6% body fat. I had never been there before, and this year I want to see, can I go even a little bit further? I love those explorations, and I love meeting the voices in my own head that emerge when I'm pushing my own blue to black lines. And so this is just another avenue for me into being able to chase that another blue to black line for myself.
That's beautiful. Well, we'll end it on the same note we began, which is you definitely are someone who practices what you preach and leads by example. And I really do appreciate that blend of the intellectual understanding, but you're not just isolated in a lab somewhere in the ivory tower, actually applying it where the rubber meets the road. You're doing it every day too. So I really appreciate that about you. And thank you for coming on and sharing your work with all of us here in New Fit Nation.
Well, thank you very much, Garrett. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
Awesome. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will see you on the next episode. Remember to like, subscribe, and all those things.